series of public conversations about artist publications, curated and edited by Nico Dockx and myself as part of an ongoing research project in collaboration with the Middelheim Museum in Antwerp, of which the library has opened to both of us in order to examine it on its contents of artist publications. First of all, welcome again. The fact that you're here sitting down and watching two people talk about books and listening to it and participating means that you consider this more important than anything else you could do tonight, which gives us a common ground. Thank you for that, which is a good starter. No demotivated students here, but people into printed matter, as a matter of fact. So what we're going to do tonight is actually present our research for the first time to the public. The project started in March 2022 and will continue until December 23. So it's an ongoing project which gives us the time to examine the collection of the Middelheim Museum, the library collection that is, in order to highlight the presence of artist publications. And Nico and me felt that this is a question that is being asked by many organizations that do collections of contemporary art and archives and books. That is, are there possibilities and ways to highlight the presence of publications made by artists in the collection, whatever look and feel they could have. And our project actually is basically about making the discrimination between art books and artist publications, which we will dig into tonight. Secondly, also how these specific publications could be disclosed physically and digitally in collections, in libraries of museums and so on. So the research has a conceptual approach and also a technological aspect to it, which why we consider it quite interesting, because old school media like books here are combined with new media as digital technologies in the field of archiving, library collecting, cataloging, indexing, and so on. So first of all, Nico and me in the summertime have digged into the library and physically scanned the shelves of the library and physically took out all the publications we considered artist publications, which created a sub-collection of more or less 1,700 items, containing books, magazines, catalogs, hybrids, and things hard to define. Secondly, the museum, together with partners, is investigating how this label of artist publication could be fixed onto an item in the whole process of cataloging and disclosing, which is not really our cup of tea, but we are part of that conversation as well. And thirdly, Nico and I are writing on a manual that could be used by librarians, book collectors, archivists, museum curators, and maniacs in general, in which we try to explain what the main difference between an art publication and an artist publication is, without falling into theoretical, philosophical, or meta-theoretical discussions, which provides a challenge, because trying to define an artist publication is like trying to define an artwork. We do not try to define art. We never do. First thing you learn in school is that you don't try to define art because it will bring you in problems anyhow. Same happens to artist publications, which we consider to be artworks. So it's very hard to define them without killing them, making them dead things. But at the same time, part of the project indeed is that we would like to provide some criteria and characteristics. So, and this in-between walk we are doing now. So my presentation here tonight is like a short survey of the text that we are working on, which provides a general introduction, a typology of artist publications, and some possible criteria for discrimination, for identifying. During the process, we also receive feedback. If tonight interesting suggestions or ideas pop up in the audience, we will take them with us in the text. So gradually the text will become better and better, as we hope to publish it end of 23 in an English version as a book that could be distributed and used by book people all over the world. That's basically the prospect. So I will give this short introduction. It will be illustrated by some books I brought from my own collection, which are basically things from the 1960s and 70s, because first of all, I love that period in art and artist books, but also because some of the classics in the field were published in that period. So it's a bit of a canonical selection I made very quickly. Nico afterwards will present his selection of books and publications from the library of the Middelheim Museum, which we selected together, which he selected for tonight. And as a kind of a book DJ, a boujay, does it exist, the word? No, we should launch it today. Like a boujay, Nico will show the things while discussing them. He will also show the things while I'm discussing my paper. As you can see, we created a three-dimensional environment, so no escape is possible. You will be surrounded by experimental book publishing. Let's hope we all survive this tonight and we sleep well tonight. So what we actually did, Nico and me, was not only checking the library, which was more or less 50,000 volumes that we saw, 55,000 volumes. Yeah, mind-blowing if I think about it, but that was not enough. We also checked some collective publications and some dossiers by artists, looking for ephemera. We also consider artist invitations and posters as artist publications, so they're marginally part of our research project. Well, first of all, maybe the first book can be shown already, Nico. The title of this project is A Kind of a question mark, and A Kind of a is a quote by American artist Edward Ruscha, who made this book in 1963, 26 gasoline stations, which is now considered to be like a canonical artist book, and also one of the very first conceptual photography artist books. When asked in an interview by an interviewer what effect he wanted to create with making this kind of deadpan book, Ruscha answers, I realized that for the first time this book had an inexplicable thing I was looking for. Inexplicable. And that was a kind of a That's what I've always worked around. It is a device, he says, to disarm somebody with my particular message. A lot of artists do that, use that. And this kind of this disarmament, this kind of perplexity that the artist wanted to create also leads us in this quest for a definition. Because I think quite a lot of book dealers and collectors and librarians sometimes get a book in their hands that triggers this question, question mark. And this kind of a for us is exactly the definition of an artist book. As explained by Ruscha about his canonical book of 1963, which was actually rejected by the National Library of Congress in Washington when Ruscha sent a copy to it. They just sent it back with a polite letter that they did not want to keep it in their collection, which actually illustrates how this book falls in between everything. It's not a photo book, it's not a commercial book, it's not a corporate book. It is something that now is defined as an artist book, but at that time the topic artist book did not exist yet in the way we use it today. You probably know the book. It shows what it tells, 26 pictures of 26 banal gasoline stations taken by Ruscha, very grainy pictures along the Route 66 in the United States. No text, no introduction, just the title page, also designed by Ruscha, who was a graphic designer apart from being a pop art painter, as you know. And it triggered a series of about 10 artist books that Ruscha made in the 60s and the 1970s. So that is where the title of this series comes from, a kind of a. Our basic starting point for a definition to work with, to make this manual, is that an artist book is a publication. An artist publication is a publication not about an artist, but by an artist. It is not a publication about art, but as art. But mainly the fact that the publication is made by one or more artists gave us the fundaments for a definition. Which means that for us, and we took a lot of our personal experience, Nico as a bookmaker and an artist and a publisher and a collector, and me as a writer, a curator and a collector, we take our baseline from our own experiences, but also from the existing literature on artist publications, which is rather big. And the baseline, I think, that first should be taken as granted is that it is a publication by an artist. So the authorship, artist-author, is crucial in understanding what is an artist publication. But then, of course, the problems rise. You could ask yourself, what is an artist? Which makes it incredibly tricky immediately. And also, how do you know that a publication is made by an artist and not by a critic or a curator or a philosopher or maybe a graphic designer who at that time does not consider him or herself as an artist, which is also a very tricky field. So the first part of the manual actually is more like a typology. What kind of artist publications do exist, and kind of cover the whole field of possible artist publications in a collection of a museum or an archival institution. First of which is artist books. And the first example is a book that I brought by the German conceptual post-minimalist artist Hanne Darboven, a book published in 1975. It has not a real title, but it is sometimes referred to as information. And it contains 35 drawings, reproduced each on one page, in which you can see the typical drawing / handwriting style of Hanne Darboven, which is actually her signature style in artist making, not only bookmaking, but also her practice, refers to writing as drawing as means of controlling time. This is a typical example of an artist book, because everybody can see that when you take this book, you immediately get this feeling, what is it? It's a book that is unreadable. It is a book that does not contain an explanation. It is a book that does not allow for communication. It is a book that does not contain reproductions of art, but it is a book that is actually a work of art. You could easily feel that it is impossible to take away the imagery from the book without destroying the whole look and feel. So the book is a container that is necessary to hold the work of art, which is the set of drawings / writings by Hanne Darboven, 35 pages. Artist books are the most commonly known form of artist publications. They are also quite easily recognizable. But there's many kinds of artist books. We already discussed the photo book by Ed Ruscha. This is more like a drawing book / artist book. But there are also books that can be considered archives, books that can be considered parodies, books that can be considered fake books, sketchbooks, graphic novels, artists' novels, books with concrete and visual poetry. So the genres in the medium of the artist book, there are a lot. So I would like to stress the fact that an artist book is not a genre. An artist book like this one or the Ruscha one is a medium. And in the medium of the book used by artists, there are quite a few genres to be found in the course of the 20th century. They all developed and they're still developing. For the moment, I can say that a lot of artist books also are hybrids. This is like a pure artist book. The same can be said for Ruscha. But today, a lot of books by artists also contain information on the artist, assembled by the artist, and can be considered hybrids between the book as a creation and the book as documentation. A lot of artist books today kind of seem to wander between the book as documentation and the book as creation, almost falling together regularly. I'm going to put up my reading glasses to see my notes. An important aspect as well is, and that is a mind you for collectors and librarians, an artist book does not have to be bibliophile. Both the books I brought, the Rouchet and the Hanne Darboven one, are not numbered, not hand-signed, are not containing original prints, are basically printed very cheaply in a large edition size. The Hanne Darboven book is 1,000 copies, which is a large size for such an unreadable book, I guess. The Rouchet books in the beginning were printed in 400 copies, but Rouchet reprinted them whenever he was out of copies. So from the 26 gasoline stations, he made 3 editions. 1963, 1966, I think, and this is the 1969 edition, which means that they're unlimited edition, basically. So a mistake that happens quite a lot of times in archives and libraries is that artist books are always considered like rare, bibliophile, highly limited, hand-signed, hand-numbered, and so on, containing prints. That might be the case, but it is not a necessary criterion to talk about artist books, because they can be very cheapish and mainstreamly looking, which is actually the power of the artist book. Rouchet's book looks very mainstream, but it is totally experimental. The same with Darboven. It looks kind of like a plain volume, but it is highly experimental in its concept and its contents. Another discrimination is an artist book is not a book object. Quite a few artists have been using books as part of an assemblage, an installation, or they use the book to kind of manipulate it, drill holes through it, or glue books together, or cut them up into unique objects. Those are book objects, meaning artworks using the book as a material, like you could use clay or paint or whatever, or collage techniques. Sometimes in literature and exhibitions, exhibitions with book objects are titled as artist books, which kind of also confuses a little bit the definition. It is obvious, I think, that the library of a museum will not contain unique books treated by artists as sculptural objects. They belong in the collection of the museum, not in the library or the book collection. A second category that we included in our survey is the artist catalog. An artist catalog is a catalog made for an exhibition for which the artist has played a crucial role in concept, design, layout, editing, and so on. Since the avant-garde of the 1950s and 60s, a lot of artists have been creating their own catalogs. Artist catalogs are, I think, a little bit of a more problematic category, because artist books are known very well, Rouchet, Darboven, and so on. Artist catalogs are a little bit of hybrid, because they are mainly kept as catalogs and not as artist publications. So here the discrimination is harder. Actually, you should be able, by your knowledge or by looking in the colophon of the catalog, to see how and in which way the artist was involved in the condition of the catalog. This is a famous example. It's a catalog for a Soloist retrospective exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1978. Exhibition for which Lewitt, who was also a graphic designer, like Rouchet, created the catalog. So the whole design of the catalog, the typography, the layout of the pages, the composition of the photographs within the pages, the sequences, is completely conceived by Soloist, excuse me. Soloist also made books for other artists, which makes it even more complicated. A book with the writings by Robert Smithson designed by Soloist is an interesting case. It's a book with writings by Soloist, but the book is designed by Smithson, but the book is designed by Soloist. In the case of artist catalogs, the librarian should check out the colophon, and hopefully he or she will find a reference designed by, and then the name of the artist, or edited by the artist, which in former times did not happen very much. Here it is even part of the subtitle of the catalog, that the book was designed by Soloist is part of its characteristic. And I think Soloist thought it incredibly important that people knew that he also designed his own catalog, which means an involvement that is typical for a certain generation of artists that we can connect with the minimal, post-minimal, conceptual and post-conceptual periods in Western European and North American art. Today, talking about now, most of the catalogs for exhibitions on, of course, living artists, per definition, are co-edited or co-designed by the artists. I think today it is hard even to find a catalog that is not co-created by an artist. So a lot of catalogs today could be defined as artist catalogs. Why do we make this discrimination? Nico and me, and I think all the people involved in the project, feel that this catalog is a documentation about Soloist, but it's also a work by Soloist and can be exhibited and catalogued as such. It has, let's say, an exhibition value. Making an exhibition on Soloist actually could include the books designed by him, which makes these documents more than just documentation on his oeuvre. It is also part of his oeuvre. Third category is the category of the magazine. The artist magazine, that is. Magazines created by artists go way back. Think about the 1920s, Dada, Futurism, the style, Surrealism. A lot of avant-garde groups of the 1920s published magazines as part of their artistic strategy. Actually, most of the stuff we know about the early avant-gardes comes from their magazines and not from their individual unique paintings or sculptures. But especially from the 1960s on in Northern America and Europe, a lot of artists started creating their own magazines. Partly as a collective practice. Most of the artist magazines were done by groups of artists. Think Cobra, think Zero, think Fluxus, for instance. But some artists had so big egos that they completely made their one-man, one-person magazine, like Chef Gijs, whose Kempen's Informatieblad issue 1 from 1971 can be seen here. It's a magazine inspired by an existing tabloid that he created himself to go with an exhibition, a one-man exhibition he had in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp, the famous exhibition in which he proposed to blow up the whole museum, as you probably know. Instead of a catalog, Jeff Gijs just asked the budget and made his own publication. So this artist magazine is actually also a catalog. And it is also a work of art. It contains advertisements, it contains very grainy pictures of from Jeff Gijs' archive. It contains an interview with Florent Bex and so on. So also this publication can be considered to be both creation and documentation, or creation as documentation as creation. You probably know that Jeff Gijs, who passed away quite recently, continued publishing issues of his Kempen's Informatieblad to go with each exhibition that he had. So he categorically refused to have a catalog. He always published a new edition of the Kempen's Informatieblad, which of course could completely change in layout and in printing technique. But that in a way refers to the autonomous position and the authorship of Jeff Gijs, keeping in control every aspect of the exhibition, including the documentation and the catalog publication. From the 1970s and 80s on, a new kind of artist magazine popped up, which is a zine. Think about punk zines, music zines, but of course also artist zines. Zines that radically exploited the do-it-yourself techniques of photocopying, Xeroxing, and printing and distributing by hand. So especially the punk movement has triggered a whole movement in very cheaply made do-it-yourself zines by artists. Yeah. The problem is, dear people, that for each aspect that I'm discussing now, we could talk for hours, but we're not going to do that. There will be more evenings on these topics. A fourth category that we discriminated is the artist page or the artist's contribution. Here we talk about works made for the page by a visual artist. in the context of a magazine or a catalog or a collective publication anyhow. Artist pages are the most difficult medium to discover because they are per definition hidden within the covers of another publication. Artist pages should be found or looked after. When I buy a collective publication for my collection, I immediately check the contents and see if there are artist pages by individual artists, and I put them separately in my archive in order to gradually see what kind of page works were done by a certain artist. And certain artists, like for instance Lars Wiener, did a lot of page works that are never inventoried yet, because they could be anywhere, in magazines, in catalogs, in ephemeral publications, and so on. This example shows a catalog also in a tabloid format of an international gallery exhibition group show in Düsseldorf in 1969, curated by Konrad Fischer, Prospect 69, which has pages provided by the galleries and their artists. Some galleries just made a kind of advertisement style contribution. Some galleries invited artists, and some artists themselves took over completely the whole page or the spread of pages. Here we arrive at the one I would like to show, which is, of course, a very significant and characteristic. Please come in. Geen probleem. A very characteristic page by Daniel Buren, the French conceptual artist, who, of course, is well known for putting his vertical stripes everywhere, three-dimensionally, two-dimensionally, and in that way actually showing the framework of the art world system by using always the same motif, be it in different colors. He kind of highlights the context of the exhibition. In Prospect 68, 1 year before, which Nico now shows, Buren also contributed a page in another color. So here you can see the radical systematical approach of Daniel Buren, who has made maybe 60 to 70 different artist pages in different collective publications, which is also a nice sport to try to find and to locate. Actually, Guy Schranen has made an exhibition many years ago in which he for the first time brought together all the artist contributions in other books and magazines by Daniel Buren. Artists' pages can appear in magazines that are very general and not even art-oriented, like Dan Graham, who kind of hacked in a lifestyle magazine in 1968 in Harper's Bazaar. Otherwise, artists can do pieces in catalogs of exhibitions, sometimes the page piece being the work for that exhibition. So there is not a work in the real world, but only a work in the catalog, which is a typical strategy of the 60s and the 70s. And like also in this exhibition, Museums by Artists, published in 1980, I think, in Toronto, for which Daniel Buren did the cover. The cover of this group publication about museums by artists is also made by Buren as his intervention and contribution to the show and to the publication in the same time. But there's also typically 70s the phenomenon where certain magazines are actually created in order to publish the work by artists. Avalanche magazine is such a good example, or Interfunktionen in Europe. They are both magazines created in the 70s by artists in order to publish the work by other artists. Plainly, one-to-one, not reproductions, but original pieces for the page space, which is actually a subgenre in the genre of artist publications. Yes, interesting. Okay, good. Then we have the next category, which is slightly more problematic. It's a category of ephemera. In most studies on artist publications, ephemera, meaning posters, invitations, leaflets, manifestos, are not included, but Nico and me really wanted them to be included. Whereas we were slightly disappointed in the collection of the Middelheim. There are not that much. There are some. But apparently most of them have been disregarded in earlier times, and only recently they are more systematically kept. Whereas we all know, of course, that from the 1960s on, a lot of artists created their own invitation cards. And some galleries, like White Space, of which this is one created by Marcel Brotaars in 1968. In this case, the gallery invited the artist to create his own invitation card, which can be seen as an extension or an expansion of the exhibition. Especially Marcel Brotaars, but many other artists of his generation considered the invitation and the whole communication system around the exhibition as part of the exhibition. And some of them, like Brotaars, gradually developed a whole practice doing that. So that nowadays, the exhibition cards, invitation cards by Brotaars, Lawrence Wiener, Richard Long, and many other artists of that generation are considered to be part of their oeuvre as an artist. You also probably know that in the 60s and 70s, a lot of artists were experimenting with democratic art, accessible art. Well, the invitation card is probably quite accessible because it was sent for free to many people. Or when you visited the gallery, you could take away a card if you wanted. So this is literally free art, where communication and creation, and also documentation sometimes, are combined. A certain gallery in Amsterdam in the 1960s and 70s, Art and Project, actually conceived each invitation as a magazine to be created by the artists. The famous Art and Project bulletins, of which about 200 were published in the end, each of one being an original work by the artist created for the magazine, which was just a double A4. So this way, a whole new field of artistic practice opens up. A field that until today is being hidden on shelves and in files and in folders and in archive boxes, but which, if you consider conceptual art as a valid movement, actually is a big chunk of contemporary art history. And a lot of artists today, like Nico also, uses his publications and invitations and posters and ephemera as works in their own right that connect to other works. I think that's a quite important issue to be taken into account for such a project like this one. Yeah, I'm ending my little list of typology. My next one would be audiovisual media, also in the periphery of the project. But a lot of artists have been making films, videos, and also sound recordings. And sometimes they were also included in a publication. This is a copy of a book that I bought after having seen the original one in the Middelheim collection. I discovered it there. It's a book published in 1962 with the writings of the kinetic optical artist Jacob Agam. The writings in the book are by Agam. The design of the book is by Agam. So it is an artist book. But in the end, it also contains a little vinyl record, 45, containing music pieces by the same artist. So the book combines written, visual, and audio elements, making it a multimedia publication. And the moment you start looking for these, you will find quite a lot. Flexi discs, vinyl discs, CDs, USB sticks, even videotapes included in books, boxes, or editions. And of course, they're fascinating aspect of the whole field of artist publications, especially if the artist, like Agam, wants to connect the visual with the audio, with the verbal, using the book as an multimedia medium, basically. So thanks, Middelheim Museum, for letting me know about this book, which I didn't know, and which was still easy to find on the second-hand digital book market. Some magazines in their own right in the 60s and 70s focused really on publishing audiovisual media. Especially since a lot of artists in the 60s were going into sound and sound poetry and so on. These things were included in magazines like SMS, Aspen, or 5e Saison and X. My final category is the multiple. which is also in the periphery of the artist publication. A multiple is a sculptural object in an edition, which can be unlimited. We normally say from 3 copies on you have a multiple, and then it can go unendlessly. A lot of artists have been doing a lot of artists have been doing multiples, especially from the 60s on. The pop generation was highly interested, think Andy Warhol. And gradually multiples started to also infect artist books and catalogs. Famous in this regard is a series of boxed catalogs created from 1967 on by curator Johannes Kladders for the Städtisches Museum Mönchengladbach, where he curated exhibitions with contemporary artists. The first one was dedicated to Joseph Beuys, actually Joseph Beuys' very first museum show. And because there was not a budget to make a book, Kladders proposed to make a small brochure for the exhibition, but both Beuys and Kladders thought that a small brochure was a little bit too poor, so they decided to have a box printed and to have Beuys added some extra value by inserting a piece of felt, which was then printed on by Joseph Beuys with his canonical paint rubber stamp. This makes this box a highly hybrid publication. It is a catalog, it is an artist book, because Beuys himself conceived the Leporello, and it contains a multiple. So this is a typical example of where, once again, an artist tries to expand the borders between creation and documentation, in the process, developing a whole new strategy of communication and publication. Kladders continued doing the boxes after Beuys, so it was introduced by Beuys. Kladders, the curator, continued them. So during the 70s until the early 80s, boxes were created by artists like Diderot, Hamilton, Richard Long, Lawrence Weiner, Panamarenko, and many other artists. Those were printed mainly in an edition, Daniel Buren as well actually, between 300 to 400 copies, which is big for a multiple and small for a catalog. So having shown this kind of set of typologies, I would like to end by proposing a few possible ways of identifying artist publications, which will be then be written down more in detail in the manual, like steps and indicators. The first step actually is some visual and physical indicators that could trigger the curiosity of a librarian, and function as a kind of a warning sign, like an orange light going off. First of all, it's a regular one because we already saw some stuff. The publication does not look or feel like a conventional monograph, exhibition catalog, or a magazine. The moment as a librarian you see something is odd or awkward or different, the red light can start to go off, and there might be the possibility that there's an artist publication in the hand. However, some artists deliberately created publications that don't have this artistic look and feel, and in the contrary, make something very plain or banal, which then is can create confusion, which is of course the whole idea of the artist. A second characteristic that can signal an artist publication is the fact that there is a multimedia aspect, like the inclusion of diverse inserts, objects, sound bearers like vinyl or CD, or visual bearers. Then, and I think that's a crucial one, it's the third indicator. The artist or a group of artists is mentioned on the publication as the one and only author. So if there's not any mention of critics, writers, curators, art historians, but just the name of an artist as the author of the publication, the authorship of the artist can be considered to be crucial here. Hence, the publication could be regarded, quite possibly, as an artist publication. Which means that in the opinion of Nico and me, also a book containing the writings by an artist, if the artist is still alive during the publishing and editing process, should be considered an artist publication. It can be a very conventionally looking book, but if, like, for instance, Per Kirkeby, who has done a lot of writings being published, if the artist is the only writer, and if it's even only text by the artist, it should count as an artist publication. Notwithstanding the banal or special effects in the design or the layout. Then we have some basic indicators which should be ideally found in the colophon. So let's hope that the publication you want to describe has a colophon, because that's of course your basic source of information. And then once again, the authorship is crucial. The authorship found in the colophon, the mentioning of the artist as the maker, the editor, the initiator, the designer of the book is a crucial factor in any discrimination. A second indicator is the date of publication. That's actually a quite obvious one, I think. A book published after the passing away of the artist can, per definition, not be an artist publication, because the artist, being dead, could not be involved actively. So actually, when in doubt, the year of living of the artist is crucial. There's only one exception. Sometimes remakes are published of an artist book made during the life of the artist and then reprinted after his or her passing away. Still count as an artist book. And sometimes it happened that an artist did a design for a publication, which was, due to circumstances, was only published after his passing away. There's a famous example of a catalog designed by Gordon Matta Clark in 1978 for his last exhibition, which he designed himself, but he died during the exhibition preparation, so the book was published after his passing away, but in his own design, which count as an artist publication. But those are really exceptions. 3, in the colophon, the publisher, quite often, like in the case of Dieter Roth or Ed Ruscha, artists were also publishers. So knowing a little bit about artists' publishing houses can help you to discriminate artist publications from none. Also, a lot of publishers in the field have been specializing in the field of artist publications. A good example in Belgium is Imschot Publishers in Ghent, which from the second half of the 80s on specialized in bringing out artist publications. So creating this list of publishing houses that are known historically or in the now about focusing on artist books and publications also helps in discriminating possibly. That actually is knowledge to gradually be acquired by the librarian, the archivist, the person involved in the creating of a collection for a museum of a library. Fourth aspect is the aspect of the design. As we already told with Ruscha and Soloit, a lot of artists were also graphic designers. Nico and me, we feel that when the artist did the design of the publication and he's mentioned or she's mentioned as such, the book is conceived and considered as an artist publication. It could be like contents provided by somebody else, but if the design has the authorial stamp of the artist, the publication as such could be counted as an artist publication. Following this, the artist can also be the editor, and sometimes, quite recently, a lot of times in the colophon, the artist is mentioned as the editor or the co-editor of the book. The artist being also responsible for inviting writers, inviting co-artists and curators or designers. So the moment the artist is mentioned as an editor, we consider it as an artist publication, because there's, once again, the authorship. A final criterion quite often, no, not often, but sometimes found in the colophon is the edition size, publication size, how many copies were made of the publication. At itself, as I already told you, rarity or limited edition is in itself not a criterion for an artist publication. But on the other hand, sometimes artists deliberately use edition size as a creator of meaning. Marcel Broodhaars is a good example. Some of Marcel Broodhaars' books are printed in 20 copies, some of them in 1,000 copies. So as a strategic artist, he knew very well how to limit sometimes his edition to make a very rare, almost bibliophile, exclusive publication, and on the other hand, print some titles in large edition sizes. So what I mean is that size does matter in one way or another, because quite often it is part of the artistic concept behind the publication. To me, the edition size of a book refers to the scale of a painting. You can, as a painter, you can make a tiny little painting or you can make a huge mural. To me, a book printed in 3 copies is like a tiny painting, and a book printed in 1,000 copies is more like a big painting. It has to do with size and scale and ambition and how large, between brackets, your work is. Metaphorically, but also almost physically. What I wanted to say is that rarity, books that are rare today, quite often were not at the moment they were published. Rouchet is a good example. In his time, the books were printed in large editions, but they're so sought after that today they are perceived as very rare. So rarity, of course, comes with demand. And actually, some of the books that were published by Rouchet as being very democratic and cheap, today fetch high prices because of their rarity in the antiquarian book market. But on its own right, that is, of course, not a characteristic to talk about artist publications. So finally, we should talk about collective publications. A lot of artist publications are books, catalogs, magazines created by groups of artists, for which all the criteria actually count. A typical example of such a collective publication is an assembling. An assembling is a group publication created by artists, for which artists are invited to deliver a contribution, given that they print it themselves, like in 1,000 copies. So each artist provides a set of pages in 1,000 copies, and then at the end they're all assembled into one book. An assembling magazine is a typical subgenre of artist publications that kind of is created especially for artists' inserts. I'm going to end this. My final remark could be that there is one genre that is today, in a very hybrid way, is finding its way between several ones, which is the photo book. We already discussed Rouchet and the conceptual photo book, but today more and more we see, since let's say 10 to 20 years, that photo books that once were collections of beautiful pictures, more and more tend to become authorial, where the photographer creates a narrative or a specific scheme or sequence of photographs, which makes a photo book actually as an artist book, because there the photographer is not only the provider of pictures, but also the provider of a story, a narrative, a virtual exhibition, and so on. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to give the floor now to Nico, who actually, I hope, will give some counter information on everything I said.
I will work with this microphone. I'm gonna do fast movement of books, because I brought some books from the Middelheim Museum library. A little bit in relation to what Johan just explained. Yeah, but so for example, this Solowitt catalog, when I was leafing through it, you could at some point see a wall of bricks, but now I cannot find it. Voila. So it's 2 pages in this catalog from an artist book that he made, but I'm going to be very careful because it's cracking all the time, this book. But so here is just an artist book he made in which you slowly see the shadow, like the shadows in the bricks, it becomes a little bit darker. So for me, it's like two examples of an artist publication, both designed by Solowit, but there is also a huge difference. This is more a catalog related to a show, which he designed and edited. This is more like an autonomous piece of art, maybe, I don't know. And then maybe to confuse, but I'm not gonna mix the books. These are your ones. Otherwise you... But then to bring confusion, and it's something I noticed or experienced when I was going through the library of the Middelheim, is that, for example, this book, the writings of Robert Smithson, produced after he deceased, so it could not be a book made by him, so it could not be an artist book or an artist publication. But then when I went through it, I thought like, it's like a very strange design. It felt a little bit like there's something going on, and then I found out that Solowit designed this book. So then for me, it becomes again an artist publication, because there is an author involved, which is an artist, good friend of Robert Smithson, so I think there is some sensibility towards the work that he then translates in the design. So I think these are objects or publications that for me are interesting because they follow certain parameters, but then they also dismiss certain parameters of the artist publication. Another one, which I also didn't expect, but when I found this publication on the work of Edoardo Paolozzi, I was also a little bit confused. Like, I first thought it's a normal catalog, but then I saw pages like this, and I thought, like, this can never be from him, if you know the work. And then I thought, it reminds me of something. And then I thought, I have to check. And then in the beginning, it says this catalog with a pin-up insert, which is sadly enough missing, is designed and collaged by Richard Hamilton, which was an artist in London, good friends also with Eduardo. And so then I realized, yeah, because I know the work of Richard Hamilton quite well, yeah, it's typically his way of working as an artist in collaging and bringing things together and bridging things. So again, also interesting to see that a colleague artist then takes up the design, and that by doing this, I consider this as an artist publication, not by Paolozzi, but by Hamilton. Yeah, I go from different times. I will mix. For example, this publication I selected because I saw the show in Rotterdam in the Boemas van Beuningen. It was a retrospective on the work of Thai artist Rico Tiravanija. What I found interesting in the show, to explain a little bit how it was made, it's like a retrospective where you could see nothing. So the museum was totally empty, and he just reconstructed architectures of past exhibitions. So you would go through a space that had the architecture of his first show in New York, then you would go through another space. So he kind of built within the museum empty spaces, and then programmed together with these three writers, two writers, Bruce Sterling and Philippe Areno, he wrote a script which was performed by actors. So if you would come to the museum, you would just listen to a story. They would take you from place to place, and they would say like, here you smell the curry, and then if people would like move in the space, they would say like, watch out because you hit the pedestal with this work. So it was all based on memory, which was very nice. It was like a ghost. And it's nice because the catalog of the show is just the script. So it's interesting to play. And for me, this is also like a kind of extension of the show in a book format. This book first, because we had with someone from with Sarah from the Middelheim Museum, we had some discussions about this book, because then they asked me like, well, why did you select this regular catalog of Alan Sekula, which is just a exhibition catalog. But then the book is totally edited and designed by Alan Sekula, and of course, and that's maybe a privilege because I knew Alan Sekula, I know why he was always making this type of book, which kind of balance in between, let's say, an exhibition catalog, maybe an arts publication, because these are really like photo series as they are shown in an exhibition. It's like the same sequence from left to right. So it's kind of like an intervention of a photo series in that book. He was also someone who was always very much busy with theory about photography. So I could imagine that's why there's also a lot of writing and reference. But it's his way of working. And he mainly had this type of books as his artistic output. So for me, this book is also an artist publication because of that dedication in making such a type of book. Then this was a nice surprise for myself, because when I found the book, there was these kind of interventions, like this is an intervention of Felix González Torres, which are images that he sometimes also places on huge sheets of paper that you can take with you when you visit a show in a museum, like these small text fragments or advertisements, like small reflections of daily life. The same with K.D. Noland. So it's like also, I think, just artistic interventions in the book. But then when I studied the book more, I could not find any information on that these were interventions by them. So I can only read it because I know a little bit the work and the style. Because it says never in the book, nowhere it says that they did any design intervention or editing. So it's like kind of mysterious publication, but I like the fact that there is this kind of, duality or ambiguity, or kind of like what is going on, because this is really like a work, but then it's not mentioned. So also there, I think it's a quite challenging exercise for librarians to figure out, and we discussed together and also with the people in the Middelheim Museum about this idea that one of the criteria maybe is also that the people that work in a library should educate themselves in artistic practices, because this is quite difficult to read. I mean, if you go and follow the parameter of colophon and you cannot find anything, then you miss it out. But then if you know the work, for sure, this is an artistic intervention by Torres. Maybe I do first this, because we also had a discussion about this. So it's nice to go to these maybe more problematic publications, in the sense that this is published after his death by the gallery Hauser and Wirth, I think, because they bought the estate of Dieter Roth. And Dieter Roth was a very obsessive archivist, and he made an installation which is these 31,035 slides of the city where he was, of cities that he lived or visited. And he also had in his archive from all these slides printed and annotated publications, like where you see prints from the photographs of the slides, and then writings, like diary annotations. And when they showed, I think it was a show in New York, when they showed the slides, they decided to publish one set of slides with the notes. And of course, yeah, it's a republication after his death, but I think, except for the cover, the whole thing is just the original thing from his archive. So it's designed and put together by him. So I consider it also an artist publication that was after his death just published. But we had some discussions if this is then an artist publication or not. Is that a question? Then, for example, this book from a show in the Gardens of Versailles and the Buildings of Versailles by Olafur Eliasson. But made in very close collaboration with Irma Boom, which will be one of the guests in our series of talks. She's the graphic designer from Amsterdam. And they discussed a lot together about how to make a book that also relates to the work of Olafur in choosing certain papers and certain printing techniques. It was a very expensive book to make. But this is something that Olafur and Irma did totally together. So it's kind of like, also here the question could be, is this an artist book by Olafur Eliasson, or is it an artist book by Irma Boom, or is it an artist book that they do together, and what's the role or the division line in between graphic designer and artists? And I remember, and that's why I'm interested also to invite Irma here to talk, because when I last met her a few weeks ago in Amsterdam, she said, I'm not really a graphic designer, I'm a bookmaker. So she also makes a very strong difference between, she said, I cannot do typography or I cannot really design a book, but I make books. So I think together with artists about the book concept or the book as an object, which I think is an interesting position to take. To support also the artists. This was funny because it was a surprise. And this maybe brings to the discussion, it's something that, yeah, you could barely find because it's super thin, this publication by Dan Flavin, and it's also, if I remember correctly, it's a group show with Dan Graham and a few other people that also wrote or contributed to this publication. So Dan Flavin was organizing it, and I was asking the other colleague artists to do something. Now I get nervous because it's a very precious thing. And I don't care so much about these things when I have them in my own library, but it's not mine, so I have to be careful. So when I saw this thing, it was a nice surprise because it's very hard to find. I think if you now go on second-hand market, it's very expensive. It always misses the envelope, so I think that's the nice thing that the envelope is still there. And this is super fragile. It's this kind of old computer chain paper. I'm not gonna go further because then I will lose a page, I guess. And the nice thing about this is that it also brings up the discussion, especially in the context of a museum, what to do with this. Can we keep it just in between other books in the library, or do we have to move it towards, let's say, the domain of the collection? Because this is, of course, for me, more like an artwork. Like, and can we keep it still inside of the library? That's, I think, an interesting discussion to say when or what is the relation between archive, library, collection, and how to treat it. Or maybe it can be in all three categories. I have to get it back into this.
nice to notice that this was already in the Preciosa collection of the museum.
Yeah.
It's not in the main.
No, in the main library. No. This I will do later. Huh? I think. No, but it's interesting with such an object to start to think about these relations between library, archive, collection. Yeah, also towards conservation, I think. This book was shown earlier because of the cover of Daniel Buren, but what's nice about this book is that it's a show on museums by artists, just a catalog of a project, but then inside you could see that, for example, General Idea did an intervention about the General Idea Pavilion, and there is the cover of Daniel Buren, of course, but then there is also this small insert of a very thin paper by James Lee Byers, for which you need a magnifying glass to read the text, or I at least need it. But, and then I also found out that it's edited and designed and published by the General Idea themselves, this Canadian artist collective. So also here, yeah, it's a normal catalog. I mean, it's a catalog from a show, but then there is so many artists that did interventions that, yeah, how do you categorize this object? This was also a discussion we had when we were doing the selection. Like, this is a very recent catalog by Koenraad de Dobbelaer, artist that lives in Brussels, and did the show in Wheels, but the show was heavily documented for the book, so it's like, and it's, I think there's also shows at other places that he put in the catalog. But for Koenraad, this is a work. So there is the show, but then this constellation and the perspective on how he took the photograph or had the photograph being taken is for him also a work of art. So this book is actually full of works of art. And for me, it reminds me also about how Marcel Brotaars was, in most cases, doing very similar approach, because he made catalogs like this one, for example, of the Musée des Aigles, where he put a lot of eagles together in, it was in Düsseldorf. And these are the two catalogs that went along with the show, but they're very fragile also. But also there, it's like, it's the inventory of some of the eagles. So there is on the one hand the show, but then at the same time, this is more or less the show in a portable form. Yeah, this is another example of. First, I thought it's a normal, just a catalog of Guy van den Brande, but then also when I was leafing through it, I thought, shit, it's. I don't know. Is it really just a catalog? And then it was another colleague artist, Mark Verstokt, who did the design, who was a designer, as Johan explained. But then there is again this question, like, because Mark designed it, did he design it as a designer, or did he design it as a colleague artist, as a good friend of Van den Brande? I don't know. This is something to further explore, and then to see in which category such a book lands, if it needs to land. Yeah, as we've been talking about Chef Gijs, we saw the very thin Kempis Informatieblad. This is very heavy book. And it's the archive of as it says, all the black and white photographs till 1998. And it's just a book that contains all the whole archive. Like, without any further... So this you can say is like a very typical artist book. But it's very interesting, almost like as an anthropological or sociological survey of not only his own work, but just how time shifts and the environment in which the artist was working and living. I don't know the complete story about the book, but at a certain moment it was put out of the market, like he banned it from the...
It was not released, I think.
Oh, it was never released? Because I bought it when the show happened, but then after the show I think it got wrapped and put in a basement. And I think now Frans Mazareel Centrum, just before he has died, bought the whole lot. So now you can buy it through them, but price went up very heavily, which is a pity. This I also found interesting. Oh, the camera is not a little bit, but it says Juan Munoz, which is a sculptor, of which they have works in the Middelheim Museum Park. Title of the book is called Segments, and it was for a show in Chicago, I think. And what I found interesting here is that it's an exhibition catalog, let's say, or it goes along with the exhibition, but then it's just a story. Like it's it only has one image of this little wooden structure somewhere in the mountains of, I think it was Peru or Bolivia, where apparently at the beginning of the story it says that the helicopter with a few researchers crashed somewhere in the mountains, and they found back this notebook. But I think it's Munoz writing the story, partly fiction, partly reality, I think. And a lot of the writing is about this structure, which is a structure that they built in the square of that little town in the mountains to indicate a kind of private spot in a public space. So it's a reflection on a house structure, so everybody could just enter, be on itself or herself within that public environment. They would do it every year, and then they would burn it at the end of the year. And he talks about this structure, and if you read it a few times, the story, it says a lot about how he worked as an artist. So it's actually, he's writing about his own work, but metaphorically. And this was just the catalog of the show, which I think is interesting as an artist publication also. Like, yeah. Then there is this kind of penguin books you can get in New York in the metro stations, and Philippe Areno did not let's say a small story on love, or but he made a sort of comic book thing, and this was distributed on I don't know how many hundred thousands of copies that they made. So this is also a way of artists to intervene in a structure that already exists, like existing types of publications that you can or abuse or misabuse, or I don't know, like transform into something else than the regular standard. This is a Stanley Brown, to show again a quite hands-on, straightforward artist publication, but the camera can...
In a cover by the museum library?
Yeah.
Johan Pas.
Yeah, the cover is normally not around this book. So they destroyed part of they glued it in, which we saw a few times, books that they, in order to protect them, actually destroy them. But it's this. I mean, I'm not criticizing the museum. It's just the same with these, which I found strange. Or maybe, yeah, because they put the barcodes also as stickers in the books. Yeah, maybe it's more something you can criticize, because I write in my own books in my library, so I destroy probably a lot of them. Yeah, this is a beautiful Lawrence Wiener book that he made for the White Space. And if I remember correctly, Annie told me that it's based on Kafka, the Tintin, the Kafka books. I don't know how, but this is a very similar one by Philip van Snick, which is also, yeah, an exhibition catalog for a show, because the curator or the director of the museum wrote a small text, but then instead of a normal catalog, it becomes a typography and an intervention that he designed or made himself. Then something we didn't do yet, but which I maybe at a later state I'm interested in, I don't know if Johan wants to join me on that, is that when we went through the books, at least in my case, I was surprised that at certain, I mean, if you go through all these books, certain periods in a specific museum are covered by the same graphic designer. So there's in Van Abbe Museum, there was Walter Nichols who was doing the design for most of the catalogs for years. In the Stedelijk, there was Sandberg as a director doing his own design. There is also quite, like Seth Sieglab or Harold Seeman were also doing a lot of the designing cladders in collaboration with artists in specific moments in time and specific places. And it was very surprising for me to see a kind of line. So that when you take out a lot of these books, you think like, this is probably again, yeah, it's Van Abbe, yeah, it's Walter Nichols. And this is not highlighted yet. I was thinking like, this could also be a nice category to start to think about these books that in this case, it's a show by Laura Grissi, but it's designed by Walter Nichols in collaboration with the artist, but the artist is not mentioned. For sure, it's in a dialogue, but in the colophon, it's just Walter Nichols, so you say, designer, and then it goes to another, it's not in the artist publications. And I think it could be interesting to, at a later state, also investigate this, because I found it interesting to see that there's certain times with certain graphic designers where interesting things happening, but there it's more even ambiguous, so there's not so much information about it. The Maurizio Annucci catalog for the ICC. Most of the ICC catalogs that we saw in the museum are just regular catalogs, and maybe in that time they were making more nicely made catalog, so you think, interesting, it's maybe an artist publication, but then in most cases it's just a catalog, except for a few exceptions. Let's say, like in this case, it's also very fragile. Maurizio Nanucci put together a few things, and I think the fold, no, I'm not gonna open it because I think it sticks. I see that. No, but there is like a lot of things inside, like an envelope with a card, another poster, colored sheets. Yeah, but the vinyl is missing. Yeah. Yeah, that's what we could think, that they put it out and put it in the media. I don't know, like not printed matter. But in this case, it means that if you have 50 of these catalogs of the ECC in your library, you have to check all of them to see which is just a normal catalog and which is a more like an artist publication because of the content or the way how things happen within the maps, because the maps look all the same. So. This I found yesterday when going through the selection. So also interesting, I mean, it's just from gallery shows or presentations, but then how this publication is made is almost an artwork by Hans Hake. Same with this one. Are there any questions so far? Because I can go on with showing books, but I'll just to go back to this. Yeah, it would be nice to talk rather than me put. In the meantime, I can show books. I also wanted to talk about this book, but I forgot the book that I had to bring from my own library, sorry. But maybe I can explain. There is this book made by Stéphane Mallarmé, Un coup de dé, which was just a poem. And then Marcel Brotaars in '69 crossed out the poem so that you could see the architecture of the poem in the book. So it was just all black lines. And he just changed, he crossed Mallarmé and he said Marcel Brotaars. He crossed poem and he put image. And then I think he crossed the publisher, because I think it was published together with White Space, that book. So he made from the poem a visual interpretation. It became an image. And Cedric Wynne-Evans, when he had a show in the Single, he referred to that book, but he was doing cutouts. So he was also putting a poem, but then a little bit in the same spirit of Mallarmé and Brotaars. I think he looked at both artists to but this you can barely see on a camera. So it's cut out text of a poem that he wrote. Yeah. But it's the same size and reference to the book that Brotaars and Mallarmé did. And I wanted to bring it just to show the lineage, that sometimes a book gets remade and made and changed over time and that it feeds. And maybe it's maybe strange to end with a book that I made, but to end with a story of this book, which started in 2001 when I was still studying, and was invited by the curator of the show on Broodtaars in the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels in 2001. It was the first retrospective show of Broodtaars in his own country. I mean, in a place that was for him very important. And the funny thing is that when I was helping the curator with the show, there was a lot of fights with the family, and at a certain moment the show got censored. Some works disappeared from the show opened, and the catalog never was made. But I knew that they were working on it because I saw some of the printouts, and so I asked the curator, like, when do you think this book comes out? Because as a young person, you're more interested in the traces of a show than the show itself, because the show is very temporary and the book you can still carry on. And she said, like, oh, I don't know, maybe we can try it another time because now we don't get the copyrights for the images. Then in 2005, she was directing the museum in Nantes, bought a few works from the family for the collection there, organized the Mallarmé Broodtaars Symposium. She thought everything would be fine. I went there because I was interested in the thematics, and I arrived and I said, oh, maybe it's a good idea to relaunch the book 4 years later. And she's like, oh, maybe I will talk to them about it. The first day went very well. The second day, total disaster, fight with the daughter, with the wife. Second day didn't happen. She gave up. And that's the moment where I thought maybe I should step in. And it took me some time. I think in 2006, I contacted her again and said, where can I meet all the people that was working on the book? So all the writers, the designer. I visited all of them, asking them for permission, because I wanted to get their go. They were all very enthusiastic to publish the book. And then I asked the curator, can I see the maquette? So then she said, it's in the Palais des Beaux-Arts, so just to go to the archive. Because of a previous project there a few years before, I was not allowed in the archive anymore, so I could not get in. That same time, they were calling me for the Prix Jeune Peinture Belge, the prize for young Belgian painters. And I applied with this project of publishing the book in order to get a ticket to get into the archive. So I was nominated for the prize, went into the archive, couldn't find it, so I was very frustrated not finding what I wanted to work with, and then being stuck with this prize. But when I left the museum, I bumped in the street into one of the people that worked there, and she's like, ah, you're so fucked up. And I said, like, yeah, because I couldn't find what I wanted to work with. And she's like, ah, but it's in the museum, huh? But it's in a safe, like in the director's office. So I went back inside and was able, a few days later, to go and see the maquette. It was a very strange, almost Godard-like detective kind of feeling, because I was in a room with the object, could not take a pencil, a photo, camera, not a phone, could not talk about, I had to sign papers. But then I saw the maquette and I was very enthusiastic, saying like, okay, I really want to do this. And what I then did is I made this artist book, let's say, taking the exact book as it was. That's what, it had no cover, so I designed, I think this may be the only thing we had to do for making it. We completely remade it as it was. The only thing we did is black out all the... So we did the same thing as Broodtaars did with the Mallarmé book. But in this case, it's not erasing a text, it's erasing the image to bring maybe Broodtaars back to poetry. But by this, bypassing the family, because, yeah, the copyright issue regarding the images was totally okay, we just... And then the book was published, and the perspective, because the problem was that the family didn't like the new perspective on the work by the writers. And in this case, I was able to publish the writing without images. except for the reference images of which I had copyright. And then with this, and luckily, but this is something I found out later, is that if I would have published it in America, I would be in trouble with lawyers, because in America also the captions of an image are copyrighted. In Belgium, luckily, not. Because it's easy, like you can take another catalog of Broodtaars and say, it's this image, and then you can look at it. It's no problem. Huh? Voilà. Sure, yeah.
So, thank you very much, Nico. You're all still awake? Okay, I can see your eyes still open. Cool. Are there any questions, reactions, suggestions, ideas that you would like to share or bring in, having watched quite a few titles and heard a lot of stuff, facts, and ideas? Yeah. Please yell because the acoustics are not so good.
How do you feel like the role of the artist books change in an age where physical publishing is becoming more important than social media?
So how the role of the artist book has changed recently in a digital context in the, yeah, okay. My answer would be that it has become more important because I can see that the moment digital communication started to become more and more important, more and more artists started to make books again. So what is lost? What is lost in the what is lost in the digital communication is found in the physical communication of the book. So I think that's one of the reasons why so many artists start printing again and publishing zines, magazines, books, but not as a tool for communication, because the digital, of course, is much better, as we all know, but more as a tool for slowing down, maybe, and creating a sensuous form of communication, touch and feel, look and feel, and so on. Nico, what would be your answer to that question?
I may be the wrong person to ask, but because I'm not on social media and I've been struggling for 20 years maybe to work on a website, but no, it's really because I cannot find the tools yet or the technology to do what I want to do, what I can do with books. So for me, all the books I've been publishing in the last 20 years, and it's 200 something, they're for me really tools of communication and tools to generate things with other people. And this I cannot do on the digital platform, for me, personally, yet. I tried many times with different programmers, and each time you bump to, it's like, oh, this is not possible. And it's like, why is it not possible if I can do it in such a thing? Why it cannot happen there? So I'm still trying.
Once again, book publishing as an alternative, literally, for digital communication. Yeah.
But it's, of course, in my case, it's a very specific way of using the books, which is also sometimes a difficult discussion with, let's say, a museum who buys all the things or people that buy it from me. But in most cases also, I'm not really selling them. I'm more like giving them, because they are really like tools, which is, of course, a very different thing if I come to you and I give this to you than if you visit my work on a website or you scroll a page on Instagram. It's a different depth or a kind of connection, which I would love to do within the digital field, but till so far I cannot find a solution for that, or a way in which I feel comfortable, or where I can have the same intention when I see somebody. It's like, here, it's a book, and there's I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's something very intuitive, or I don't know.
What's also interesting in this thing is that books are much more resilient than digital. It was Lawrence Weiner who once said that once you've put a whole edition of a book into the world, you cannot take it out again. If you make 1,000 copies of the book and the book gets distributed all over the world, you will never be able to destroy or take away this publication, whereas in digital, closing up websites and servers and accounts is quite possible, actually, from the technological point of view. In book printing, that's not. So it's also kind of an alternative medium also in that way, like a subversive medium, being very slow, very tough in a way, and unretrievable from the world. But it's smaller, it's slower, it's heavier, and of course it has no moving images, it has no sound. The book actually is still a very limited medium also in many ways. Yeah. A lot of people said that with digital books would disappear, but they did not disappear. They just changed their position as a medium. Any other suggestions for our research?
Well, it also maybe has to do with a different form of memory, I think. I mean, both the digital as the analog have a memory system, but I think it's a different one, which makes it interesting also to combine or to find a bridge between, but I think we still need a lot more experimentation to bring them into dialogue, my feeling.
And the book has a longer history and tradition to refer to, whereas the digital is relatively young also. Yeah.
Okay. Can I throw a question to the? I look at the people of the Middelheim Museum, of course. To say, like, how do you experience what we till now did? Like, is it an interesting exercise to do, or gives it more problems, or sleepless nights, or I don't know,
headaches?
Is it something that you can pick up and work with? How will it also relate? Because it's, I mean, we do it through the invitation of your museum, I mean the Middelheim Museum, but the intention is to make a protocol, let's say, in between brackets, that can be used by many other people, not only in this context, but other museums, other libraries, people that collect books or who want to think about books.
Thank you, Nico, for that question. I'm Veerle, head of collections of Middelheim Museum. I think it would be also interesting to hear Sarah, who is the project coordinator, and she is more focused on to also the digital aspect of the program of the research project. Well, it is exactly and more as I would hope that it would bring up to this research, because it's so important to define or look at this collection and see this or this extra quality, this extra status of this publication. It was exactly what we tried to see, that this is part of artistic practices and also an artwork, not just a book. It's more than a book. I think it's also challenging us, and I really love that, to resist certain categories in one typology of or a book or an artwork or a medium object. So resisting this categorization and also embracing this ambiguity and trying to capture this as a tool just then to disclose this, these art practices to a wider audience is what we are trying to do. And also to explore its exhibition potential. That was exactly what we were hoping to find. So, and I think you really managed also to bring that up yet. So yeah, I'm really super happy. But I'm sure that my colleagues in the library, working in these systems of categorization, that they will have maybe sleepless nights. So it's maybe, Sarah, if I can give this to you also.
Sleepless nights, yes, many. I think the manual could be a problem for people who work in the library, because it's so broad. And like you have the example of Dieter Rold. You know, I have a problem with that example. Yeah, because for many of the things you have shown, you need a kind of knowledge of art history and of the work of all those artists. And I myself am an art historian, and I have problems with recognizing with recognizing these artist publications. So I think it's it could be difficult. Yeah. So I'm very curious how other institutions gonna work with his manual. But it's something the future will show us.
Yeah, maybe also the manual is just a possibility or an exercise, which is not definite, of course. And I think to underline the ambiguity, I think is interesting, because that's what many artists sometimes do when they make something, to test these boundaries or these limits and to stay in that ambiguity. On the other hand, what I also found interesting, and we didn't talk about this today, is that of course if you go through this library, I mean we spoke briefly about it before the event, is that of course it's a very Western, very white, very male collection, which is also for us difficult, because you have to make this protocol and you only have a reference of all these very stereotypical. But again, I think that's why the exercise is interesting, because now we can also start to think or suggest to the Middelheim to update the library, to fill certain gaps, and also to think also of, let's say, collecting, if you then talk about how to build a collection in such a museum, to also collect artists that doesn't per se have a sculpture in the park, but have a sculptural practice in other forms like books or records, and that you can also integrate in your museum policies as part of collection procedure, let's say.
Yeah, and also to follow up on that, what also is becoming very clear is it makes sense to have artist publications in the Middelheim Museum, which is like an outdoor sculpture park. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine that people ask, is there any relation to the artworks that are there? Well, exactly, it's also public art, I think. Mm-hmm. And many of these artists that are represented in the park with three-dimensional big works, they are present here in these public works that are that have a huge spread and are in public space. And so I think it's a public art form that we have to explore more, especially because since conceptual art, some of these works physically disappeared or not that important. Maybe the work of art is in the library, it's not in the park, it's in the library. And especially in these times of biennales and of big temporary shows where works disappear, what's left is in the library. And the study of public art in its three-dimensional form is more visible or can be studied in the library. So I think it really highlights also the importance of these artworks and the book collections in relation to public art. And that's also super important, I think, to highlight that sometimes the only physical trace of these interventions in public space are in the library or in these books.
Ik moet die micro niet hebben, hè. Ik moet die micro niet hebben.
Okay, thank you, Veerle. Anybody else who wants to share a suggestion, an idea? Yeah, Andrea?
It's for the recording, I think they want you to put... okay.
So I was wondering, you described the typologies, and it feels to me that the main sort of interface that you encounter when you look at a book to be cataloged or put into one of those typologies is authorship. And I was wondering about anonymity. Did you encounter any publication that doesn't have authorship or that problematizes authorship? I know the example of Schede, this magazine from Antwerp. Yeah.
I know in this one.
But I wonder if even in the Middelheim library there are examples of such. Yeah.
Question, Andrea. Anonymous publications. Well, of course they are, and some, indeed, the magazine Schede was published as a magazine for anonymous artist contributions. Of course, hardcore art historical knowledge in the end always cracks up the anonymity and tries to find out who's behind it. And then, of course, art historical knowledge can help to kind of identify stuff. And this also referring to you, Sarah, I think it's crucial that librarians also slowly and gradually build up art historical knowledge. When they're working in a museum context, I think that's necessary in the recruitment, that they at least have the curiosity and the willingness to learn and to gradually build up their own archive in their mind, which they will be using to refer to books and publications and editors and so on. But anonymous, I don't know that much anonymous books, apart from the Scare magazine. There's a famous one by Mike Kelly, which is called By Anonymous, but we all know it's done by Mike Kelly. So quite often, in the end, it's known who's the writer.
Well, recently, but it has nothing to do with the Middelheim libraries. That I'm studying a little bit more Stefan Mallarmé's work, and apparently I found out that he had 8 newspaper issues which were called La Dernière Mode, which he published in Paris in late 1878 or 1879 or something. And it was just a reflection on fashion, but he was doing it under a series of, I think it's 9 different pseudonyms. So he was writing to the people that were reading the journal, so he was giving feedback under one name, then he was writing about menus and restaurants, another, and then he was writing about women's clothing on another name. So he was like, and nobody for a very long time knew that he was doing it. Now, of course, people know, but it's interesting because then I could say, like, was this an artist publication by Stefan Mallarmé? Because he took so many roles. He did the design, he did the editing, he did the writing, he did the drawings. Like.
Also like that question because now I think maybe you should look into the boxes with books that never got categorized and classified because maybe there was no name. So maybe it's interesting to have a look at these boxes or the storage collection.
This is what I expected. We should have never said yes to this invitation, because now they will keep us working there every summer.
You're all welcome.
Thank you. Any more questions, reactions? I'm seeing people from the antiquarian field. Chris, do you have anything to add from the slechte background? Because as an antiquarian, you daily have to discriminate between the value and the validity of a book. Eh?
Yes, value is one thing, but as an antiquarian, I'd like to know what I'm selling or buying. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, we have quite a lot of boxes with things which I saw and thought, huh. So maybe there are interesting things, maybe it's just old paper, but even when I'm 30 years in business, I don't know all of art history. So when I find things, of course, the great names I know, but other things I don't know. Mm-hmm. But some things you feel, that's something special. But then it starts. So yeah, I'm waiting for your handleiding manual. Yeah.
Yeah, and things also change over time, because you could say today this is just a piece of paper and not valuable, and then in 10 years it becomes something else. I mean, the same with the Rocher. I think they were sold for $2 and now they're $15,000. So it's like, but this is only an economical value. There's also other values, I think, in trying to figure out what's the quality of an artist's publication.
What also will be in the manual is in the end that, of course, one person never knows everything. So being a librarian or an antiquarian, a book dealer, a book collector, an archivist, it's important to build your own network of people who know stuff. And quite often it happens that somebody asks me about the publication, or I ask somebody else, do you know this, have you ever seen this? And that way information circulates also. You know a lot about a certain aspect of avant-garde literature, I know a lot about 60s conceptualism, and we help each other when we find something which we consider probably as important, but we don't know really why, and we want to know more about it. So this network of knowledge will be one of our suggestions in the end of the manual. Don't try to do it on yourself. Try to to be part of a network of people who might know more about the stuff you are dealing with. It's about sharing. Sharing information, sharing is caring, I always say, and it's also part of this story. Interesting is that Nico knows a lot that I don't know, and vice versa. So we also, as a team, we're like complementary. Nico also was, as you saw probably in his selection, he was focusing far more on hybrids, books designed by artists, where I was more focused on hardcore artist books as works of art, independent. So also our perspective was slightly different. And in the beginning, we really had to tune a little bit and adjust our positions, because just imagine that the two of us would start selecting the shelves of the museum with totally different criteria. Sarah, you in the beginning, you were quite anxious about that, huh? And really asking us, what is your frame of reference? How will you select? We were like, oh, we'll see. Oh, no problem. We'll manage. But in the end, we found it quite important to on a daily basis see each other and compare and find a common ground, which we actually did find. But nevertheless, Nico's perspective as an artist is different than mine, which is an art historian. So it's always important to share your own information and to be able to accept information and receive it by other people.
That's why we also want to invite other people to the program.
This talking program is part of that also. Yeah.
There's an artist duo, Gerlach and Koop from Den Haag in Netherlands. Gerlach and Koop from The Hague in Netherlands, and we invited them to also give a talk on this subject matter, because they worked, or they're still working, in the National Library of Den Haag, doing a quite similar, more or less, project. And it's funny because they are at the end of their process, and they decided that they wanted to write a text, not as us, a manual or a protocol for detecting artist books, but they would go for the book that you cannot find in the library, the book that is not detectable, the book that doesn't want to be found, the book that doesn't want to be cataloged or categorized, which I think is interesting to go and write for this subject that doesn't want to be traced in such a big institution. So it's interesting that we can bring some other perspectives to just open up the discussion.
Okay, I think we can wrap up. No more questions. Thank you very much for being here, being so patiently and so curious. Thank you, Sarah and Veerle, for hosting this research and pushing us to continue it and do it longer and even better. And you're all invited for the next talks, which haven't been scheduled.
No, but I have to say something. You need to go to Art and Research Antwerp at Instagram. For those that have Instagram, so I will miss it, but yeah.
Yeah. So please watch the communication. When more or less will be the next?
Well, the next ones are all programmed. I think, but I have to check with Irma. Normally, the next one should be with Irma Boom. I think on the wait. Think 5, 6, 7th of February. I think.
February. Okay.
Tuesday, 7th of February.
Yeah. Okay. We'll be here as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for being here. Enjoy the night. Bye-bye.